Thank you for joining me for this episode. Today, I'm delighted that we get to speak with Dr. Mila Brujic and Dr. Alan Glazier on what the FDA was thinking when it came to Sydnexis and Atropine on a special joint episode of the Myopia Podcast and the OI Show. Well, thanks again for joining me. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Brujic this time. Buddy, it's always fun to get to do a podcast together for the OI
Ditto.
show.
Ditto.
Yeah.
I agree, Dave.
And who better to have on than the legendary Dr. Alan Glazier? It's awesome to get to speak with you and have this as a topic we get to talk about.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for having me, guys.
So this is kind of a little bit of a conversation we actually had offline a couple weeks ago. Is just kind of trying to figure out what was going on with Sydnexis. And some of you may or may not know that Alan is kind of one of the OGs in the myopia community. He's practiced for 25 years dealing with myopia management and has been doing it forever. Everybody knows you as the Odie's on Facebook, but before you had Odie's on Facebook, you were the myopia guy. And I know it's a big part of your practice and always has been. It's always fun to hear about your friends who are known in one area, but then clinically, they do a ton of something. And that just always surprises Brujic and I sometimes when we find that out about people. But tell us a little bit about your myopia journey over the years briefly.
Well, first of all, I thought the myopia guy was Mr. Magoo, but if you want to call me the myopia guy, I'll accept it, right? For the people on here too young to remember that, Google Mr. Magoo, Macgoo. That's all you'll need. Um, yeah, so I my father was an OD, and I got out in '93, and it was before there was reverse geometry lenses. He was a huge RGP gas perma pop, even before RGP fitter, and he taught me how to do ortho K with round lenses. If you can
Mm-hmm.
imagine getting that done, that was a real skill, and back in the day
Mm-hmm.
where you didn't have tools for everything like that. And
Mm-hmm.
he taught me about how, with the relatively small ends, sample sizes, how he believed that it slowed down or halted the changes in myopia. And so I learned from him basically and then, but there wasn't at that point any clinical data. And then around, I don't know, 2003 or four, out of Ohio State, Mark Bullimore, and everybody started publishing some really good,
Mm-hmm.
solid, peer-reviewed stuff. And I just became a passion because, I mean, what
Yeah.
is optometry without myopia?
Yeah.
Everybody needs to be a myopia expert, I felt. So that was,
Yeah. Yeah. And here we are today, and it seems like we are on the precipice of something to explode. So I'm excited about that, which is part of why we wanted to bring you on with your community being as large as it is, and talk about something that we think is really important. And why the foundation, just to set this, is we want to talk about this approval of a low concentration atropine through the FDA and how it was blocked by the FDA for Sydnexis. And why this kind of came about is we're realizing that if Sydnexis doesn't get this product through, there's a likelihood that we will never get an approval of a low dose atropine through the FDA. And the regulations are becoming more and more challenging. The approval of a low concentration atropine or any pharmaceutical actually is through an entirely different pathway than it will be for the devices that we have. And so a whole different group of people are looking at it. The criteria is different, and it was blocked. And now we need to figure out, well, why was it blocked and what needs to be done about it? And I wanted to start just talking a little bit with you, Brujic, because you do myopia management, quite a bit of it actually. But I see you, and many people do in optometry, as optometry's optometrist. And people look to you and say, well, why myopia management? Why is this a big deal? And if you're listening, you're probably interested in myopia to some degree, but just hit on a couple of the highlights of why you think this is a big deal. What are your thoughts?
I think prevalence is huge. And
It's
whenever
pretty big.
whenever you see something that affects 1/3 of children today
Mhm.
and up to 50% of patients estimated by 2050, That's massive. And
Yeah.
as soon as you see something that affects that number of people, you pay more close attention to it, which is part of the reason why there's all this work looking at saying, we know how to fix it, we know how to correct the refractive error, but that's just the end stage of this. When I think about myopia progression, I really think about it as this phenotypic condition of eye elongation that manifests as a refractive error that gives people blurry vision.
Mhm.
And what we're doing right now is, I should say, when I graduated 23 and a half years ago, we were just providing corrective lenses for them. Now we have the ability to influence that. And that's where the real power happens because, again, when we see axial elongation, it's a physical response that's happening in a very small, compact space. And there are real physical realities that happen there. So we're trying to slow that down. And that's why it's important to me. The fact that I can tell a patient's parents, we know you had this, and we have the ability to influence this in a positive way so that your child can hopefully, in the best set of circumstances, stop, but at least slow down the rate at which they're progressing so they don't get to be like you is empowering from a clinical standpoint. So, again, it's part of the reason why I became passionate about it and used several oft FDA labeled treatments.
Mhm.
So we had the FDA treatments available currently.
Brujic, why do you think that myopia management hasn't really kicked in maybe a primary care setting? And may I propose is maybe the fitting of a specialized contact lens, or maybe even fitting kids in contact lenses hasn't been something that everybody wants to get into, which Alan and I think is crazy because we've been fitting ortho K on kids forever. But it seems that this is one of those solutions, this and spectacles, to really open the door.
Yeah, I agree. There's always a barrier to contact lenses, and one of them is a real barrier, and one of them is a perceived barrier. The real barrier is if a child says, I want nothing to do with contact lenses, and the parent says, I don't want my kid to do anything with contact lenses because I don't think they're old enough.
Mhm.
That's a real barrier. Perceived barriers are when we walk into the exam room and a parent or a child asks about contact lenses, we say, well, we can't because you're not a certain age. And these certain ages are oftentimes picked arbitrarily. There were studies that looked at kids between 8 to 12 years old versus 13 to 17-year-olds to see which ones would be able to wear contact lenses more successfully years ago, published by Jeff Walleen. They were identical. But
Yeah.
for some reason, we as a profession feel that 13 is the youngest. So there's that perceived barrier that we have to even
Which
talking about
myopia,
lenses.
we've done our damage by
We have.
13 for most.
Well, the other thing too, Dave, is then now you add orthokeratology, which is a more specialized
Yeah.
design, does require more intricacies to the fit, does require a um, more specialized view of the ocular surface, the cornea. It does require some technologies that maybe not every office has. So now you've created all of these other barriers. My site tried to reduce some of those barriers, but there's
Mhm.
still the perception that if you're not fitting them on younger kids, you're not going to provide the benefit like you are. So, Dave,
Yeah.
when you talk about the thing that everybody corrects kids with is lenses or ophthalmic lenses,
Mhm.
that opens it up. So now there's really no reason for a child not to be offered this treatment. And drops, there was always this perceived barrier. I mean, there are some clinicians that are just uncomfortable working with compounding pharmacies. And if you work with a compounding pharmacy, well, what strength do you pick? What strength do you select? Where do you start? So having something that's a fixed formula, that's predictable, that's safe, and that's repeatable for kids makes it
Mm.
easier for the
Yeah.
clinician that really, again, is uncomfortable working with compounding pharmacies. So I think that the advent of an ophthalmic lens in our armamentarium plus an atropine drop that is easily available would open things up tremendously for these kids.
Yeah, I agree. And, one group that particularly us myopia managers are really, really, those that are doing a lot of it are really aggressive at is that pre-myope or early myopia. We're not going to get spectacle coverage for somebody who is under minus a half. And no kid is going to wear glasses if they're under minus a half. So my atropine particularly plays a big advantage into the kids who are heading toward emmetropization faster than they should, whose axial lengths are larger than it should be, but yet they're still hyperopic. But we can look at their crystal ball and know where they're going. And optical intervention can't really bring any value to them. They're not going to wear spectacle lenses, but we see them heading, and that's a great place for atropine, is to slow it down when it's happening fast in those early years. And that could be a 1 or a 2 year before we would intervene with optical intervention. And so that's another place where atropine just really has its
Dave,
great place.
you bring such a valid point, Dave, because this is where we potentially have the most influence when
Hmm.
it's earliest in the condition. This is where if we intervene at that level, we are really going to have the most bang for the buck in terms of that child's longevity, in terms of the reduction in potential myopia that they will develop. So kudos. I couldn't agree
Yeah.
with you more.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And Alan, you back in the early '90s when you started doing this, to have anybody say that this was a disease would just be crazy. But now we're at a point where it's well recognized as a disease. The National Academics of Science and Engineering and Medicine, the Academy of Ophthalmology, the World Health Organization, the International Myopia Institute, the American Association of Pediatric Ophthalmology and Strabismus, our own AOA and the Vision Council all have publicly said this is a disease, right? And I think that this should be speaking to our colleagues as well.
I like to use another term. Disease was not one that was in my vocabulary as related to myopia until I started seeing some of the data. But I like to use the word a handicap. Our myopic patients, even those who are mildly myopic, are handicapped to a degree when they're uncorrected.
Mhm.
So the worse they are, the more handicapped they are. And I just use that word to get across the severity of what myopia really truly is. So whatever verbiage you choose, the reality is this is definitely something that is good for public health, and in an age group that it's crucial we pay attention to and prescribe for. So I'm not surprised what happened. I have my own thoughts on what happened, which we'll talk about today. But yeah, it's definitely a handicap or a disease or what have you.
Dave, it's interesting. It's classified, it has its own ICD-10 code, the
Yeah,
International Classification of Diseases, but we just recently been categorizing it a disease. We're in a
yeah,
bizarre space when it comes to eye care. There's a lot of things that we break rules, and this is kind of one of them where we finally put
yeah.
it in the category that we initially placed it in.
I think a lot
Well, I
of
think
people.
we're all
Oh,
go ahead.
real quick, I think you're onto something there, Amelia, because look at they carve out vision and dental out of medicine. So they're always like skeptical or looking at things very differently for some reason in vision, and it doesn't make any sense exactly.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I think we're pretty comfortable with seeing those patients who are -7, 8, 9, 10, because those are the patients where, we see these risk factors for retinal pathology, and we're taught in school. What's been surprising since I brought axial length into my office is the number of the -4, 5s, and 6s that I see who may have normal axial length, whereas I see some patients who are -2, 3, or 4, and their axial length is really approaching this area where I get nervous. And I think it's important for us to understand that 40 to 50% of myopia related complications occur below what we would consider high myopia. So pathology still is occurring. It's just that there's way more people that have lower amounts of myopia, but yet they go on to. So we still have to be cognizant of that, which brings us to one of the more common treatments. And I think, Mila, I want to ask you about this is atropine is being used, but kind of set the stage for us as it seems like thousands of practitioners, both in ophthalmology as well as in optometry, are using atropine. But why is it such a bummer with where it stands now?
So the challenge to acquiring and accessing it, we have to
Mm,
prescribe through non-traditional routes. So, Dave, right now, when we call something into our compounding pharmacies, we can't use our e-prescribing. So that's not a barrier, but it's a
it's a
speed bump.
hassle.
It's an
Yep.
access point. We have to do something different to get access to compounded pharmacy substances than we do traditional pharmacy substances. And in that same vein, whenever you're sending something to a specialty pharmacy to be compounded, there's always a perception that you have to at least provide a little bit of comfort to patients about saying, no, this isn't FDA approved, but this is something that's accepted as one of the treatment options because it's a completely different path than they're used to acquiring their medications through. And the bigger thing is Dave, where you get your medications compounded is
Mm.
going to be different than where I get them compounded. Alan, it's going to be different than where you get them compounded. So there's real variance that exists regionally and across the country. So again, there's a lot of this array, this level of non-consistency that at some point has to become concerning, in particular with as many kids that are being prescribed atropine in this
Mhm.
way.
Mhm. Alan, you've prescribed atropine for your patients. What have you dealt with in the world of compounding?
Yeah, I haven't really had any challenges per se over the years. I can't tell you that atropine prescribing has been high on my list of
Mhm.
ways I've treated. I've mostly done it optical ways, but I can tell you that, I worry about the things that everybody worries about, the concentration, consistency, the purity, the where they're sourcing it from, and those kind of things. So yeah, just this typical, I think, issues anybody would worry about when they're taking compounded medication.
Yeah. So one of the horror stories in my practice, and I've had several, but one of them is one of my patients continued to progress, and we kept increasing their dosage and increasing their concentration. We got to a point where we were increasing their concentration, and they were at 0.1% atropine, which most people are doing zero point zero 0.01, zero point zero 0.02, or zero point zero 0.05. And this particular patient was a very fast progressor, and we were doing everything, including optical intervention as well as atropine. And it was a year before we realized that the compounding pharmacy was continuing to fill the prescription as zero point zero 0.01.
Hmm.
Meanwhile, both the patient and myself, as well as the prescription that we sent to the pharmacy, showed zero
Oh,
point 0.1. And that was our understanding. And this
wow.
patient, over the course of a year, progressed considerably, even though we were doing everything else we could to hold back what was happening. And the reality is that the studies have shown this. Tamiana definitely has published on this. Bullimore has published on this. Is that we're not getting what we think we're getting, and the stability of atropine that is compounded loses its concentration very quickly because of the pH. It's very difficult to get an effective dosage at the pH that we want to have for our patients, which enters the story into Sydnexis coming onto the market 10 years ago, 2015, 2016, Sydnexis started, and they went to the FDA and they said, hey, we want to do a study. And for the two of you, I know you've looked into this as well. They went to the FDA and they said, hey, give us an idea of what we need to do to get an approval of the drug. So can one of you kind of walk through what your understanding is for what the FDA said needed to be accomplished?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can take that one. They set endpoints, like progression of minus 0.75 diopters. Was it a binary endpoint?
Mm-hmm.
Annual progression rate endpoint, and they ran a study with a high sample size. They had 850, close to 850 participants finish the study.
Mm-hmm.
36% of them were 16 to 18 years old. And the data was exactly, they met all the endpoints that the FDA asked them to submit. There were
Mm-hmm.
no adverse events. And they showed that it was effective at a 50% reduction in progression, which is similar to what you see in the other options of like the contact lens
Yeah.
category. So
Yeah.
it was no worse, and it was, might be better in a lot of ways, but it's needed because of what we talked about before.
Yeah. So I just want to, I know what you meant. There were no unexpected atropine. Like we would expect maybe some pupil dilation. We would maybe, there's some of those expected
Well,
adverse events, but there was
yeah,
nothing that it was like, oh, wow, that surprised everybody
right,
with
right,
regards to, right?
right. Like
An eye
the
drop.
adverse. Oh, I'm sorry, David. The adverse
Well,
events that you get. are, light sensitivity
Yeah,
and blurred near vision, and you're sleeping with this drug. So,
sure.
it's the typical little redness maybe, but yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah.
That's what I meant.
Yeah. No, no, I got what you were saying. And what was interesting is the FDA said, we want to show a from my understanding, we want to show a statistical significant difference in those that are 7 that are on the placebo versus those that are on the drug of the percentage of patients who progress by 0.075. Is there a statistical significant difference between the 7-year-olds, the 8-year-olds, the 9-year-olds, and then as an aggregate? And what I thought you pointed out really interestingly, and Brujic, I'd like to hear what you think about this as well, is that they included subjects who, at the end of the study, 36, a third of them were over the age of 16.
Yeah. So this, Dave, you bring up a really interesting point here, because the way disease typically progresses is it continues and it continues and it continues and it continues. Think about dry eye, for example. Easiest example. It doesn't stop. It keeps escalating if left untreated, and it varies at the rate of progression over time. But there's not a point in dry eye where you say, here's the expected kind of slowdown phase. And when you talk about myopia progression, that's exactly what we expect. We expect the
Hmm.
younger a child is where they start their myopia progression, the more it will be at the end of the progression, or if it ever ends progressing. But for standard myopia progression, which now I'm thinking there may not be a standard, but we know that it goes through a curve where younger patients go quicker. And
Yep.
then towards the end of the teen years, it does tend to stabilize. So less of a difference in those older patients. We would
Hmm.
expect that, and they still met the endpoints even under those set of circumstances, which
Yeah.
really holds the level of scientific integrity of the study and
Hmm.
how well they did it and how well the drop actually works in the formulation that they provided to the
Yeah.
people in the clinical trials. It just validates it all.
Hmm. Yeah. So, every other disease that we deal with in eye care gets worse over time, whereas with myopia, it slows down. And so the most aggressive of treatment, and where most of us are like, well, we'll see how it works. We'll try this. The
Mhm.
most aggressive of treatment needs to be at the beginning.
Earlier.
And what was really interesting in their study is the subgroup who had progressed the most before the study had started showed 50% reduction in the progression. And those are considered fast progressors, which we look at other studies and see what fast progressors are. But in that subgroup who was really fast progressing, they showed a considerable improvement where, how many of the placebo group that are 15, 16, 17 years of age are progressing by 3/4 of a diopter anyway. And what they wanted to
Not
see
very
is that
many.
those in the placebo group progressed a lot and those that in the drug group didn't progress very much. Well, the reality was most of the people in the placebo group didn't progress by 0.75. So statistically, that subgroup, but to your point, is they still met the criteria because of the younger age children that really showed that improvement. I think that's kind of interesting. This information came down from the FDA, and the FDA gave there's what's called a PDUFA date in the drug world, where is we're going to tell you what the information was, and the FDA gave Sydnexis a letter that's called a complete response letter, and in the letter, the FDA questioned the magnitude of the clinical effect, and which is interesting because it was a binary primary endpoint, yes or no, statistically significant. We did meet it or we didn't across the entire group. So I think that's kind of an interesting, and I think that speaks kind of to what you were saying, Brujic, is they met their criteria, but of course, the group that was over the age of whatever, 15, 16, 17, 18, probably didn't meet that criteria as much, but yet the magnitude of their data because of the younger group met that. And I kind of was wondering if either of you had anything to say about that or what your thoughts were on that.
Well, what's interesting, Dave, is that you typically expect the companies that are providing the clinical data and the governing body that's going to allow it to be approved to communicate when there's questions like that. That's one of the interesting things about this dynamic here. When the FDA looks at every other disease category in eye care, it's very different. Myopia is unique. I think that's part of the reason why it's just being considered a disease now. I think we're starting to realize more so about it. And I think that there's going to be an opportunity for clarification because, again, it doesn't follow the traditional rules of every other disease that we think about when we're talking about treating something in the eye care space. And I think when that clarification happens, I think the regulatory bodies will probably understand what makes myopia different and likely provide variable consideration in the way that they initially responded to the data, which again, from a logistical perspective, you kind of take a step back and you say, if I didn't know anything about refractive error or myopia, I would kind of look at that data and say, I get it. I kind of understand why it seems a little bit misrepresented. So again, offering the point of clarification, I think is going to be super, super
Yeah.
important with the FDA. This is something that's needed. I mean, the ability to provide something to our patients that's fixed, that's stable, that's in a consistent, predictable bottle, that we understand all the parameters around it. I think that's an important tool to us. People that specialize in myopia progression management, but also
Hmm.
to people who just want to get involved in it and want to
Hmm.
provide some help to their patients.
But Alan, you mentioned that 2/3 were under this certain age. And I have to think that something may have been in the study design to include this larger or this older age group, especially at 1/3, because we don't look at study designs of devices to include this type of an age group. And so I think that's an important thing is that you look at the statistical significance of it, and it's a binary yes or no, but also the overall looking, and hopefully someday we'll see that publication of the improvement for those particularly young patients who we really want to be putting on. I know that atropine is my go-to for my 3, 4, 5, and 6 year olds. And as we're getting into 6, 7, and 8, we'll start to introduce optical interventions. And now we've got Stellist as bringing something that we can introduce at those earlier ages. But we need something that we know is safe, that we know is going to be effective, and we know is going to produce the outcomes that we need for those younger kids. And I have to think that that 1/3 was added. Maybe by somebody who didn't think, we need all kids. Maybe that's what it was as well. It's used for kids. We need all kids in the study.
Yeah, I agree with you. And also, one of the things that bothers me is question for the experts on this panel: what method of myopia control has the most peer-reviewed studies that have shown a positive effect over the most number of years?
Yep.
And it's atropine. Since the 1970s, there have been, I don't know, more than
Hmm.
20 I can think of studies that show that effect. So this just confirms everything that we've learned throughout the history of treating children with myopia control, and finally getting down to low doses where it doesn't have the rebound effect. We know even more now on that it's effective and it's a positive thing. So it just burns me up to think that that's something like that. I mean, even if you had a third of these, that's still a decent sample size to go by the
Yeah.
data, right?
Yeah.
Ditto.
Well, good. A great conversation. Any thoughts closing here before we shut her down, Alan?
I just think it pains me to think what it takes for these companies to get these products to market. And to go back
Yeah.
to something you said, David, in the beginning, and it's so important here is there's a very real possibility that because if we're not able to combat what the FDA's decision was, that this will result in us not having a RX atropine ever because of the way the
Hmm.
business side of this works. And I hope that's not the case. I hope everybody starts to have, people should sign the petition. By the way, maybe we could put up a link to the petition in here.
Yep.
And there's a petition that they're going to send to the FDA. We have over 1,000 signatures, but we could use as many as possible so that we can all have our voices heard and explain to them that this is a real disease we're treating here, that is handicapping children.
Yeah. Any
Dave,
closing thoughts, Brujic?
yeah. So, this has been a long process for this formulation. And we're getting close to the end of that process, but I do have faith in the regulatory environment. I do understand that it's there to keep patients safe and to also approve things that are effective. And I do have faith in the system. I do have faith in the fact that when they understand the whole uh, myopia as a whole, and when they truly understand really what this has the potential to be, I do have faith in the system that they likely will approve this. I think in a year, 2, 3 years from now, we're going to say, "Remember when this happened with all of this?"
Hmm.
Because I do have faith in the system, and I do have faith that when things are done appropriately, which Sydnexis obviously has done, um, under the right scrutiny and the right eyes, this medication, this pharmaceutical is a game changer for myopic children.
Well, I can say that I think the people at Sydnexis are hopeful that everyone is as optimistic as you are. We certainly want to see this. Ellen mentioned something, and that is a petition, and we will include that below. You can go to change.org and type in atropine, and you'll see the petition that's there, signed by hundreds and probably thousands by the time that you are hearing this. And that is going to be really important. And here's the reason why is we don't have this public knowledge yet, but for any drug to go through the FDA, they're going to be spending somewhere in the neighborhood of $50 to $100 million to pull off one of these studies. And this particular study took 6 years of data. It was a 3-year where they followed each of the patients, but it happened during COVID, so it took 6 years. So for investors to come in and say, hey, let's put atropine through again and try it, probably is not going to happen. And that's really why we need to get this right, which brings me to we need that petition signed. Because when the FDA looks at this, they're going to be like, is this a big deal? Is this something that is a big deal? Are practitioners thinking this is important? Or is this just a drug company trying to sell drugs? We need to prove to the FDA that this is a big deal to us. And so go to change.org, type in atropine, and you'll see that. We need every signature that we can get. On behalf of guests of the OI show, Brujic and I, but also the Myopia podcast, we're grateful, Alan, that you joined us. And to those of you who are listening, we're really grateful for you joining us for this particularly exciting episode that we had that was joint. Make sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on the OI show and the Myopia podcast.